Hello, it's Father Rick again. I just thought I would answer some of the questions that have been asked. Kate asks, she understands that every church in the Catholic Church throughout the Catholic world has a relic in the cornerstone in the main part of their altar. That is true. She wanted to know, young Kate wanted to know if I know what they are. Unfortunately, or regrettably, I do not. I'm here almost 16 years. I've looked at all kinds of data. I'm going to see if perhaps the diocese would know, but they're really very small. They could be a piece of bone or a piece of hair. It's very small. And even if you saw it, you'd have a very difficult time actually seeing it. But that's the best I can do for our particular relics here. Thanks for asking. Another question comes from Carol. Why do I use just a drop of wine and water? Well, it's really very simple. The water part is just a little bit of mixture, and I use a small amount of wine simply because I don't require that much. The amount of wine is a certain amount, yes, but that's a personal thing that each priest does. Some use more, some use less. I'm one of the less. And I also find that's important when we're having maybe several masses in a day. I may have a morning mass, a funeral mass, and things of that nature, and so I just use a small part of that. It's just my own personal decision as far as that. I guess it comes down to just taste. There's no particular way of doing it. There are people who maybe use 3 drops of water, and what they're probably doing is doing one in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. It's wonderful to have numbers that have a particular meaning, but sometimes we get carried away. A lot of our personal things, as you may realize, are wonderful for our own spirituality, but sometimes we become so attuned to them that we make them doctrines of the church and Christianity, but in fact, they're just personal customs. We have to be careful of that. It always reminds me of years ago when we were taught not to chew the host. And that's another fallacy that people do. If you find it as a form of respect, that's one thing, but to teach it as an absolute requirement, especially if young people are just being formed, is practically wrong, and it has to be stopped. And many places I've been in schoolwork, as well as in our parishes, I stop it immediately upon finding it. I can remember as a young boy getting ready for First Communion when somebody was teaching us, and they were teaching us that you have to let it melt, and have Hawley, a priest, walk by and corrected that. And so that's something that we might want to think about. It still exists in some. Again, it's a personal thing that someone's doing, that's fine. But to propagate it as an absolute need, like a defined doctrine, like the resurrection or the birth of Christ, is terribly wrong and very misleading for many people. Another question that's come up, Eric, and others have asked this question. When reading the scripture, they sometimes find themselves somewhat confused or uncertain, and they become frightened by that. Well, don't be frightened. Study the scripture has a number of areas. Once again, personal interpretation is one thing, but in order to get to that point, one needs to understand that there are scholars who study this, and scholars don't have all the answers either. But, basically speaking, the scripture never loses its force, but the context is very important. Like, for instance, take a parable, like the parable of the Good Samaritan. Why did Jesus make the Good Samaritan the hero in the parable of the story? He was driving a point. The Samaritans were a mixed breed. They weren't just Jewish. They had other blood in them, and that was anathema to them. And the Levite was, like all priests, not allowed to touch the bleeding body unless it was one of his own progeny. That was an honor code, and he was challenging that. Well, unless you know the context, you can't understand the basic meaning. And the context is important in some cases. Then, the next step, after you've understood what it means, is to take it and apply it to the world in which we live. How does it affect you and me? And I think it's obvious. It talks about prejudice and bigotry, and also understand that somebody's title doesn't make them better than anybody else. So that's basically it. And we shouldn't be afraid of the scripture. Read it, understand it personally, and when you have a question, there are people that can begin to answer the question. Memorizing the scripture, some people do that. But I'm not sure that literal understanding is really understanding, because translating the Bible is very difficult. The Hebraic language is dominated by verbs. Our language is not. How do you go from one culture to another over a period of time? It is not easily done. So to take everything literally without understanding context and other things of that nature and the history and so forth becomes very difficult. I'm not trying to make it more complicated than it is, but I think if you understand what I'm saying, you have to be patient with it and with yourself. And very often, once again, like that second question I answered, some personal things can get in the way, and one has to be careful. Hopefully those answers will be helpful to you. Have a great day. Thank you for answering questions. We'll do the best that we can, but again, we don't always have the answers, but we'll try to find them as we go along. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.